It was another hectic morning in the courtroom, the kind where the air felt thick with tension as Judge Thomas Sterling took his place at the bench, his black robe flowing like a shadow over the hardwood floor. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the list of cases in front of him, each one more tedious than the last. He had grown accustomed to the routine of dismissals and fines cases that rarely held any weight, but that was the nature of the job. That was until Tina Richards walked in the doors, her name called by the clerk. A sharp intake of breath seemed to ripple through the room as she entered. Her presence was striking in a courtroom where most people were either nervous or intimidated. She exuded calm. She was a black woman, dressed in a tailored suit, her eyes steady, her steps purposeful. She did not flinch when she was called before the judge, as though she was accustomed to the way the system worked. She stood with a quiet dignity as the judge glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had seen her before, but never as a defendant in his courtroom. Something about her confidence bothered him. It was an unspoken rule in his court. Those who spoke up too much, those who questioned authority, were often labeled troublemakers. But Tina, she was different. She didn't seem like trouble. She seemed too poised for that. But as far as Judge Sterling was concerned, that was a red flag. The case was simple. Tina had been accused of contempt of court after speaking out of turn during a previous hearing. She had tried to explain herself. When the judge had dismissed her statement, she had spoken, and she should have remained silent in his mind. This was a breach of protocol, a serious one at that. His voice rang out with authority. Tina Richards, I'm afraid you've been found in contempt for your actions during a previous session. The court does not tolerate interruptions or disrespect. Your fine will be $500, no exceptions. The words hung in the air, but Tina did not flinch. She did not seem surprised by the fine or the accusation. She simply nodded her head and replied, Your Honor, I was not trying to be disrespectful. I was simply trying to explain my position. I was not interrupting, nor was I trying to challenge your authority. She spoke with a calm precision, her words measured but firm. Judge Sterling's jaw tightened. He hated being interrupted, and he hated when people questioned his decisions. In his eyes, this wasn't just about what had happened in that previous hearing. It was about control. He didn't want to look weak in front of the courtroom. He couldn't allow anyone to think they could question him without consequence. But there was something about Tina's demeanor that threw him off. She didn't seem rattled by the fine. She didn't seem afraid or apologetic. She stood her ground, and he could feel a stirring of frustration rise within him. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, too. They were watching every move, wondering how he would handle this situation. He glanced at the file in front of him once more, then back at Tina, who still stood there unwavering. And for the briefest moment, the judge hesitated, but only for a second. He waved his hand dismissively and said again, Your fine is $500. Case dismissed. The courtroom was silent as Tina turned and left. But something lingered in the air, something felt off. The other people in the room had noticed it too. Tina had not been like the others. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't intimidated. She was something different. And the judge had no idea just how different she really was. As Tina left the courtroom, the whispers started almost immediately. People exchanged glances and spoke in hushed tones about the woman who had just walked out in such a composed manner. Despite being fined $500, Tina didn't show any sign of distress or even frustration the way most people would when they were treated unjustly. Instead, she walked out of the courtroom as if she had been in charge the entire time. The murmurs didn't escape the attention of Judge Sterling. He was already aware of the buzz as he sat back in his chair. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had been a judge for years, and he prided himself on reading people. He believed he could sense when someone was being difficult, when someone was pushing their limits. But Tina had thrown him off course. She hadn't reacted the way he expected. She didn't seem to care about the fine, and there was something unsettling about that. But as he turned to the next case, the thought faded into the back of his mind. The judge had more pressing matters to attend to. And it wasn't until later that day, when he encountered an attorney named Mark Davis, that things took an unexpected turn. Mark was a seasoned lawyer with years of experience under his belt. But he wasn't just any attorney. He had worked with Tina before on various legal matters and had a deep respect for her skills. They knew each other casually, but when Mark mentioned the fine in passing, Judge Sterling responded with the same casual dismissal he had shown earlier. Oh yes, I fined her for contempt. She interrupted me during the hearing, the judge said, his voice clipped and confident. Mark's face shifted. He seemed almost taken aback, as though something was off. What do you mean you fined her for contempt? Mark asked, his voice lowered, as if the question itself was taboo. You don't know who she is, do you? Judge Sterling looked at him, confused. What do you mean who she is, he asked. Mark gave a knowing look, as though the answer should have been obvious. Tina Richards is one of the most respected courtroom specialists in the state. He said she's worked behind the scenes, advising lawyers, preparing cases, and ensuring that everything goes smoothly in the courtroom. If you ever had a chance to work with her, you'd know she's practically a legal genius. Judge Sterling's eyes widened. He hadn't expected that response. In fact, it felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath him. He had assumed Tina was just another person looking to disrupt the system. But what Mark had said made him pause for the first time in a long while. The judge was confronted with a deep, uncomfortable truth. He had misjudged her, and worse, he had done so because of her demeanor and the color of her skin. His pride stung sharply. He had prided himself on being impartial, but now he realized how easily he had been influenced by assumptions that were based not on facts, but on stereotypes. In the space of a few seconds, he could feel his world shift. He had made a grave mistake, and the weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders. Mark continued, Tina has been in this field longer than most people have been practicing law. She's the one lawyers go to when they need something to be done right. She's not someone to be dismissed so easily as you did. Judge Sterling stood silent for a long moment. The words echoed in his mind. Tina Richards, one of the best in the field, and he had fined her without knowing anything about her, who she was, or what she was capable of. Judge Sterling stood in front of Tina, feeling the weight of his apology settle between them. Tina remained calm, but there was an unmistakable intensity in her gaze. She hadn't said anything for a few moments, but her silence wasn't one of acceptance or forgiveness. It was one of contemplation. She had heard apologies before, but rarely had they felt so empty, and he could tell she was waiting to see if his words held any real meaning or if they were just another form of dismissal. But for the first time since meeting her, the judge was fully aware of his own faults and the harm he had caused, not just to her, but to people like her every day. Tina's voice broke the silence. I appreciate the apology, Your Honor, but it's not just about this one mistake, she said, her voice steady, but carrying a quiet power. I've been in this field long enough to see how the system works, how people like me often get overlooked or dismissed because of how we look or because of how we carry ourselves. She paused, as if measuring the impact of her words. But it's not just about me, it's about everyone who gets treated like they don't belong here simply because of the color of their skin or their gender or the way they speak. Her words rang in the judge's ears long after she had spoken them. He had heard those same sentiments expressed before, but never quite like this, never with such clear conviction. And while he had never considered himself prejudiced, it was becoming increasingly clear how much of his own actions had been shaped by an unconscious bias he had never even recognized before. Tina's gaze never wavered as she spoke. She had seen so many people like Judge Sterling over the years, people who saw her confidence as a challenge to their authority, people who assumed that someone who spoke with knowledge and assurance must be trying to disrupt the order of things. But Tina wasn't interested in disrupting anything. She just wanted to be seen for the value she brought. And she wanted to see a system where people like her weren't ignored or silenced simply because they didn't fit the mold. Judge Sterling couldn't help but feel a shift inside himself. He had spent so many years in his career building a reputation of authority. He had prided himself on being able to read people instantly, to tell who was truly in the right and who was trying to manipulate the system. But Tina wasn't like anyone he had encountered before. She didn't need to fight for respect. She simply commanded it through her presence, her knowledge, and her unwavering conviction. And for the first time in his career, the judge wondered how many others had come through his courtroom who were just like Tina, and how many of them he had failed to recognize for the same reasons he had failed her. In that moment, he realized that he had been operating with a limited perspective, a perspective that had been shaped by years of assumptions and stereotypes. And now that veil had been lifted, Tina had not only taught him a lesson in humility, she had shown him that his authority was not just about the power he held in that courtroom, but about how he chose to use it to either uplift or tear down the people who came before him. The weight of that truth sank in deeper than anything else he had ever encountered, and he knew he had to make it right not just for Tina, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. Judge Sterling stood in front of Tina, feeling the weight of his apology settle between them. Tina remained calm, but there was an unmistakable intensity. In her gaze, she hadn't said anything for a few moments, but her silence wasn't one of acceptance or forgiveness. It was one of contemplation. She had heard apologies before, but rarely had they felt so empty, and he could tell she was waiting to see if his words held any real meaning, or if they were just another form of dismissal. But for the first time since meeting her, the judge was fully aware of his own faults and the harm he had caused not just to her, but to people like her every day. Tina's voice broke the silence. "I appreciate the apology, Your Honor, but it's not just about this one mistake," she said, her voice steady, but carrying a quiet power. "I've been in this field long enough to see how the system works, how people like me often get overlooked or dismissed because of how we look or because of how we carry ourselves." She paused, as if measuring the impact of her words. "But it's not just about me, it's about everyone who gets treated like they don't belong here simply because of the color of their skin or their gender, or the way they speak." Her words rang in the judge's ears long after she had spoken them. He had heard those same sentiments expressed before, but never quite like this, never with such clear conviction. And while he had never considered himself prejudiced, it was becoming increasingly clear how much of his own actions had been shaped by an unconscious bias he had never even recognized before. Tina's gaze never wavered as she spoke. She had seen so many people like Judge Sterling over the years, people who saw her confidence as a challenge to their authority, people who assumed that someone who spoke with knowledge and assurance must be trying to disrupt the order of things. But Tina wasn't interested in disrupting anything. She just wanted to be seen for the value she brought, and she wanted to see a system where people like her weren't ignored or silenced simply because they didn't fit the mold. Judge Sterling couldn't help but feel a shift inside himself. He had spent so many years in his career building a reputation of authority. He had prided himself on being able to read people instantly, to tell who was truly in the right and who was trying to manipulate the system. But Tina wasn't like anyone he had encountered before. She didn't need to fight for respect. She simply commanded it through her presence, her knowledge, and her unwavering conviction. And for the first time in his career, the judge wondered how many others had come through his courtroom who were just like Tina, and how many of them he had failed to recognize for the same reasons he had failed her. In that moment, he realized that he had been operating with a limited perspective, a perspective that had been shaped by years of assumptions and stereotypes. And now that veil had been lifted, Tina had not only taught him a lesson in humility, she had shown him that his authority was not just about the power he held in that courtroom, but about how he chose to use it to either uplift or tear down the people who came before him. The weight of that truth sank in deeper than anything else he had ever encountered, and he knew he had to make it right, not just for Tina, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. The following days were difficult for Judge Sterling, as he wrestled with the realization of how deeply his actions had been influenced by unconscious biases. He had long considered himself a fair and impartial judge, but now he couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that he had been blind to the reality of what many people faced in his courtroom. Tina's words echoed in his mind. Each time he saw a defendant step into his courtroom, each time he addressed a case, he thought back to her calm yet powerful explanation of how people like her were treated not based on their actions, but based on how they were perceived. He began to wonder how many others he had dismissed over the years, how many cases had been influenced by his own assumptions that he had refused to challenge. It wasn't just Tina who had been affected, it was everyone who had come before him and left feeling unseen or unheard. Tina had only been the catalyst for his awakening. But the problem was far bigger than one woman, one mistake, one fine. He had seen it in the way the system operated for years, but had never truly questioned it. Now that he had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. He couldn't ignore the weight of the responsibility he held, not just in his decisions, but in the way his decisions rippled out into the lives of those who came through his courtroom. That weight felt heavier than the black robe he wore every day. Tina's case stayed on his mind. But it wasn't just about fixing one wrong, it was about changing his entire approach, about doing better by everyone in his courtroom. He spent his evenings reading through legal journals and research he had ignored before diving deeper into the history of biases in the justice system and how they affected the treatment of people of color, particularly black women. He read the stories of others who had faced similar struggles, the quiet battles fought not with raised voices, but with steady resolve and intelligence. He saw the same qualities in Tina, but he hadn't recognized them at first, and that made him feel ashamed. There was no quick fix to undo the years of injustice he had unknowingly contributed to, but he knew that making the right choice now was the only way forward. The next time Tina was scheduled for court, Judge Sterling knew he had to approach things differently. He called for a brief recess before her hearing and sent for her to come to his chambers. Tina walked in, once again her posture as calm as ever, her eyes gave nothing away. But the judge could feel the shift in the air between them. This time he didn't speak quickly or dismissively. He looked at her directly, and for the first time in their interactions, he really saw her. He saw her strength, her knowledge, her power to influence the system without ever needing to raise her voice. He had been wrong about her, and now he was going to do whatever he could to make it right. As Richards, he began, his voice steady. I've spent the last few days reflecting on my actions, and I want to offer you a sincere apology, but I also want to do more than apologize. I want to make sure that your expertise and your voice are respected from now on in this courtroom. You are a valuable part of this legal system, and I will ensure that the people who come through here understand that. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. He had expected some form of resistance, but instead she simply nodded her approval. Thank you, Your Honor, she said softly, her voice steady. You don't have to apologize, but I appreciate that you're trying to understand. He felt a sense of relief, not just because of her words, but because he finally felt that he was on the right path. Judge Sterling took a deep breath as he looked at Tina sitting across from him in his chambers. The air felt charged with an unspoken understanding. He could feel the change in the room since their first meeting. It wasn't just the apology that mattered, it was the quiet acknowledgement between them that the system needed change, and that he had a role in making it happen. Tina remained composed as ever, but her eyes held something deeper, a sense of guarded hope. Perhaps it was the hope that his words weren't empty, that he wasn't just trying to smooth over a mistake, but that he genuinely understood the weight of what had been said and what needed to be done. He had taken responsibility, but now it was time for action. It was time for him to ensure that his courtroom wasn't just a place where laws were enforced, but a space where justice was truly served. He spent the next few weeks taking concrete steps to make the courtroom a more inclusive and fair environment. He reached out to Tina, asking if she would be willing to consult with him on improving courtroom procedures and ensuring that bias and prejudice had no place in his decisions. She agreed, but only under the condition that their work would be open to everyone, that they would ensure this was not just about one person, but about changing the way people were treated across the board. Tina's first piece of advice to him was simple yet profound. Your Honor, you need to listen more. The power of listening, she explained, is often underestimated, especially in a place like this where people are already so accustomed to being ignored or dismissed. You need to hear what's being said without judgment, without assumptions. Only then will you understand what's really going on. Judge Sterling had never really thought about it in that way. He had always believed he was listening, but as Tina pointed out, he was often filtering people through his own lens of what was appropriate or acceptable in a courtroom. His biases had colored his perception, and the more he reflected, the more he realized how often he had missed the nuances of people's stories, how often he had made decisions based on first impressions or superficial traits. Tina also worked closely with him to introduce changes in the way he handled cases. She suggested that all court staff undergo bias training so that everyone from the clerks to the bailiffs to the attorneys could learn how to spot and confront their own prejudices. She helped him develop a more structured approach to handling cases where there was a history of discrimination or bias in the proceedings. These changes weren't going to be easy, but Tina had seen firsthand how small steps could lead to lasting impact, and she knew this was just the beginning of something bigger. Judge Sterling slowly began to see the results of his efforts. While some people still looked at him with skepticism, others noticed the changes in his demeanor. He no longer rushed to judgment or imposed fines without truly understanding the context of a case. He made an effort to hear everyone before making a decision, And when he did rule, it was with more compassion and consideration than before, but the most noticeable change was in the way he treated people like Tina. He no longer saw them as a challenge to his authority. He saw them as equal partners in the pursuit of justice, and that shift was more powerful than any fine or verdict he had ever delivered. As the weeks went on, Tina continued to advise him in a quiet yet impactful way. She never sought the spotlight. She simply shared her knowledge and expertise, and in doing so, she helped him see how much more there was to the law than simply enforcing rules. It was about creating a space where fairness and equality were the foundations, where everyone, regardless of their background, could stand before the law and feel that they were truly being heard. As time passed, Judge Sterling began to notice a shift in his own behavior and in the way people responded to him in the courtroom. He felt more at ease knowing that the steps he had taken were making a difference. The atmosphere in the courtroom was changing too. People seemed to feel more comfortable. They seemed more willing to speak up without fear of being immediately dismissed. Tina's influence was undeniable. Her quiet wisdom had transformed not just his perspective, but the entire environment around him. One day, during a particularly busy session, a case came up that tested everything he had learned. The defendant was a young black woman named Ashley who had been accused of petty theft. She was visibly nervous, shaking as she stood before the judge. She had no attorney, just a public defender who seemed overwhelmed by the case at first glance. It seemed like a simple case of shoplifting, a petty offense that many judges might dismiss with a fine or a short sentence. But Judge Sterling paused before making a ruling. He remembered Tina's words about listening, and he knew that this time he had to take a deeper look into the circumstances surrounding the case. He motioned for the courtroom to be quiet and turned his attention to Ashley. He asked her to explain in her own words what had happened. She hesitated at first, but then slowly began to speak. She explained that she had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunities were limited, where people often had to do whatever they could to survive. She wasn't making excuses, but she wanted the judge to understand that she hadn't stolen out of malice or greed, but because she had no other choice. She spoke about the challenges she had faced growing up, about the struggles of living in poverty and trying to make ends meet. Judge Sterling listened without interrupting. He felt the weight of her words, and for the first time in his career, he didn't just see a defendant. He saw a person, someone who had been shaped by circumstances beyond her control. As Ashley spoke, the judge could feel the weight of his own past decisions bearing down on him, the impulse to punish someone for their actions without fully understanding the reasons behind them felt wrong. He glanced over at Tina, who was sitting quietly in the gallery, her presence a steady reminder of the lessons he had learned. He took a deep breath and turned back to Ashley. "I believe you, Ashley," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I understand that you made a mistake, but I also see that you're trying to do better, and I want to give you a chance to prove that you can." He paused for a moment and then looked over at the public defender before making his decision. Instead of sentencing her to jail or imposing a fine, he decided to sentence her to community service and required her to attend a job readiness program so she could gain the skills she needed to build a better future. Judge Sterling knew that this wasn't the easy way out. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was a step toward giving Ashley the support she needed to make real change in her life. It was a chance for her to break the cycle that had held her back for so long. When the courtroom session ended, Ashley's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not tears of fear or defeat. They were tears of gratitude. She thanked the judge before leaving the courtroom, and the ripple effect of his decision was felt far beyond the case. It wasn't just a single person who had been impacted. It was a moment that proved the power of compassion and understanding. The courtroom had shifted from a place of strict judgment to a place of second chances, a place where people like Ashley could find hope even in the face of mistakes. The impact of Judge Sterling's decision did not go unnoticed. As the weeks passed, other attorneys and court officials began to take notice of the changes in his courtroom. Many of them had seen the judge as rigid and unyielding in the past, but now they were witnessing a man who was willing to see beyond the surface, who was willing to dig deeper and question his own biases. When people came into his courtroom, now they were treated with more dignity and respect. The shift wasn't always easy. There were still moments when old habits crept back in, when the judge felt the weight of his authority and the temptation to rely on quick judgments. But Tina's influence was always there, reminding him to slow down, to listen to consider the full story before making a decision. One afternoon, as the judge sat in his chambers reviewing cases for the upcoming session, Tina stopped by to speak with him. He had been meaning to ask her how she felt about the changes he had implemented so far and whether she thought he was on the right track. As she entered the room, she gave him a small, but knowing smile. It had been a few months since they had begun working together, and he could tell from her expression that she was proud of the progress they had made, but not one to be easily impressed. Tina didn't waste time with pleasantries. "So what do you think?" Judge Sterling asked with a hint of nervousness in his voice, his tone softening. "Since you've been involved in making these changes, do you think it's been enough?" She leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "Well, it's a start," she said. "Honestly, you've made an effort to change the way you approach your cases, and that's commendable, but the work isn't over yet. You've only scratched the surface of what needs to be done." She paused for a moment, letting her words settle before continuing. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen because one person decides to be better. You're one judge in a system that has been built on centuries of bias and inequality that's not going to change with a few apologies or a few good decisions." She met his eyes then. "But it's a start," she repeated, her voice steady and assured. "It's a start." Judge Sterling felt a mix of pride and humility. Hearing her words, he had known that the journey was far from over, but hearing Tina's candid assessment made him realize just how much work remained to be done. He had started down a path of reform, and he was determined to keep walking it, no matter how difficult it might be. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, looking out over the courthouse lawn, a quiet reflection taking place within him. He had never imagined that his own growth as a judge would be tied to someone like Tina. But now he couldn't imagine his work without her insights and wisdom. The system wasn't going to change all at once, but he knew that if more people were willing to do what he had done, if they were willing to listen and to recognize their own biases, then the shift could be monumental. He turned back to Tina as she stood by the door. "Thank you for everything," he said, his voice sincere and soft. "I've learned so much from you, and I'm not going to stop now." Tina smiled and gave him a nod, as if to say that she expected nothing less. As she left the room, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a part of something bigger than himself, a movement that had the potential to change the very fabric of the legal system. And as he sat back down at his desk, ready to face the next case, he knew that his work wasn't finished, but he also knew that he was no longer the same man who had stood in judgment of Tina Richards months ago.